I'm not who you think I am. Whoa.
Okay, I'm going to justify my lack of preparation as I'm going to characterize it like this. So I'm giving this information just off the top of my head, just for the sake of what a layman Seventh-day Adventist, how he looks at it. Because I'm listening to a bunch of interesting things this morning about prophecy, Christian history, how we should look at it. Watching people who are critics that don't know what they're talking about act like they do. And so and I don't have anyone in particular in mind, but so what I'm going to talk about, this is about what the Bible's teaching about prophecy, about history, and how we should engage with individuals. Because, and I mean this, this is more about systems, not individual people. Because if you were trapped on a desert island, you might appreciate it if you're a Protestant, a Catholic, being a person rather than, say, somebody who's a Buddhist. You would find a lot of agreement, right? And I have friends that are Catholic. I like to think they're my friends. I have friends that, so it's like a perspective. It's not about individual people, or if you're a Catholic, you're just lost and a terrible person and you're guilty of the crimes of the church that had maybe even had good intentions at times, but did awful things. And if you're going to pretend like that isn't true, I think you're being naive. So why do I think the SDA church has a right to say that they're Protestant, probably more Protestant than other Protestants? Well, we're not Calvinists. So if you're a Calvinist, turns your stomach. Ellen White is a false prophet, right? So here's the thing. When going through Daniel, the book of Daniel, the church fathers are all over the place. I wouldn't be citing them as authorities on what we should believe regarding prophecy. It certainly is all over the place. But if you take the Bible consistently and you read through Daniel in the succession of kingdoms from Daniel 2, which Daniel interprets the dream as Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And what do you know? Rome is the final empire before the rock strikes the feet. Now, the dilemma for the Catholic Church would be they take over the pagan Rome, and it becomes papal Rome. This is obviously just a historical fact. The church takes over Rome. Now, if they go preterist, they can try to cram it all in, but there's problems with that. And so Catholic doesn't have an official position on this. But if we read the Daniel connecting to Revelation and continue the same flow of a sweeping one empire after the other, and you look at the details and you understand that the end of time hasn't come yet, you have different options on how you're going to understand that. But we have to look at the symbolism. How does Daniel 7 correlate to Daniel 8? How does the end of the book of Revelation, how are we supposed to mate that up with the time? Is there a huge break, like the futurists say? How do we interpret the time periods? It's not obvious to some. But I want to read a hint. Seventh-day Adventists are pretty much the last people that understand the Protestant view here, although it wasn't clear to all the Protestant Reformation, although they all did seem to think that they were towards the end period of the 1260 years. And many of them did understand that the Catholic Church and its persecution towards the truth, if you're a Protestant, what you believe is the truth, that was clear to them. Of course, righteousness by faith, justification by faith, is what really started the movement historically. Now, I think that is prophesied in the Bible. Now, depending on where your allegiance is to certain models of an interpretation of the Bible, you ought to agree with that if you are any derivative of the Protestant Reformation. Unfortunately, most of evangelicalism in America, etc., is married to their futurist idea, mainly, in my opinion, because of their wanting to separate prophecy for the Jews and the Christians, which is just frankly not in Scripture, and it has to do with their what they think justification by faith is, which is I'm saved, don't you know, and you're going to go to hell as long as you say the right words. And unfortunately, I don't think even the early Reformed people had that sort of view, but I do think they were wrong about the tulip model isn't correct ultimately. But it's easy to disregard the heritage and say, I'm not a Protestant. Well, okay, are you a Catholic? What do you mean you're not a Protestant? Do you think the men who went to the stake for the truth during the Reformation, should they have not done that? Should they have capitulated back to Rome? Because if they did, I doubt America would exist. Okay. So now I want to go back to a consistent view of prophecy in regards to understanding the flow of history and then the interpretation of Daniel. If we take all the time periods to be longer periods of time, and which I would suggest, because I don't think we should interpret prophecy so that none of that persecution is foretold when it actually fits actual history that's past, and we can see that that's more consistent with what Daniel 7, 8, and parts of Revelation 11, 12, chapter 11, 12, etc. Because we see the times, and half the time is a rendering of the 1260. Now, so I'm speaking about the day for a year principle and justifying that, because we do that with the 70 weeks. You can't deny it, because that's what identifies Jesus coming from the decree. If that principle is applied to the other time periods, then we understand that it's the last beast that persecutes the saints, like in Daniel 7:25, the whole book of Daniel, how that ties up to Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, especially as far as the prophetic periods. But we do see that in Daniel 11, it touches down to the end of days, when Christ's second coming. But regarding the day for a year principle, it actually is based, I would say it starts with Leviticus 25, which should inform us the pattern which is used to explain the sevens, which people say is heptads, but it's really weeks. And those weeks are weeks of years. Why? Because they're based off Leviticus 25. Well, the Sabbath cycle of 7 days and then a cycling over, the calendar has nothing to do with the Sabbath cycle. And that's important for various reasons. Regarding prophecy, it's important because it gives us the pattern. There's no calendar needed. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Sabbath, and then start over. Many people have tried to obscure this and connect the festivals and the Hebrew calendar. Nope. In creation, before there's a Hebrew calendar, God makes the pattern very simple. It's a cycle of 7, end of story. Now, that's how the week got invented. Okay. And then we see it brought up in Leviticus 25. And so let me read from this work. I think it's by, Hans Laurendel. Okay. From How to Understand the End Time Prophecies of the Bible. He's making a case for the day for a year interpretation, and then using it consistently. And we see that first started because in Leviticus 25, we're told about the Jubilee cycles and the sabbatical cycles, or Shemitah cycles, okay, which is a 7-year pattern. What do you think that's based off of? Why do you think the 7th year is called a Sabbath? Because it's being introduced as a cycle that God introduces based off of what he established in creation, the 7-day week, where the 7th day is the Sabbath. Obviously, this is a pattern based off of that. So, and I quote, "The Mosaic law introduced the principle that a day can represent a year. The prime example is Leviticus 25, which prescribes that the seventh-day Sabbath was to celebrate also as a Sabbath year for the land, namely each seventh year." Leviticus 25, 4 and 5 says, "But in the seventh year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards during the Sabbath year." Here, the Levitical law extends the weekly Sabbath day quality to an entire year. William Shea says, "There is thus a direct relationship between the day and the year, since the same terminology was applied to both, and the latter sabbatical year was patterned after the formal sabbatical day. Israel's law of the Sabbath year thus introduced the day for a year principle. The same principle is reinforced in the law of the year of Jubilee. Count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. That's Leviticus 25:8. This law implies that after 7 Sabbaths of years comes the year of Jubilee. So it's a Sabbath of Sabbath years, okay, is a Jubilee. And that's what Daniel's 490 years is. It's 10 Jubilees, 10 Jubilee cycles, which is 70 Shemitah or sabbatical cycles. The whole prophecy is based off that. So if you want to say it's heptads, you're just making something up. To the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, this pattern was implemented off of the Creator God and his weekly cycle, which he called the Sabbath, that he made at creation, that he made holy from the very beginning. That was the first Sabbath, before any other laws, before any covenants were introduced, officially in the sense of what we read in Scripture. So it's the 7-day cycle. The very idea of a Sabbath year is based off of the week made at creation. That's why it uses the same terminology, Sabbath year, which that's how it introduces the Sabbath principle here, the day for a year principle. And there's many other examples of this kind of principle. Again, the weekly Sabbath day stands as the model for an entire year of rest and freedom in the Jubilee cycle. The Sabbath years and their cycles of 7 years were prophetic of the coming Jubilee year. This way, the principle of a day for a year became a practical forecast of redemption in Israel's worship rituals. Now, I would argue that Jesus did have to start his ministry at the end of the 69th week or beginning of the 70th, because when he goes into the temple, he says, the acceptable year of the Lord, which suggests a reading of the Sabbath year. But that I could be persuaded otherwise. But suggests to me that was when they would blow the shofar, sort of idea. So he can't be in the middle of the sabbatical cycle, although it was probably Tishri 1 when he did that as well, or when he read that in the temple or the synagogue. I forget which. I think it was the temple. At the beginning of his ministry after his baptism, but I'm trying to remember off the top of my head there. So yeah, so if we see this principle, which many interpreters have seen this, including Isaac Newton and others, most of the historicists and over half the Protestants kind of accepted this idea because it's a consistent interpretive method. And it's true that I would say that people try to avoid calling the 70 weeks because of this issue, that if they admit that, then they're accepting the day for a year principle for the 70 weeks, and no one can deny it because everyone knows that foretold when Jesus would come, which is really important. So by trying to obscure this with calling them heptads and justifying it, you're being inconsistent. It's the reason we know they're weeks, and one reason we know there's 70 weeks of years in Daniel is because they're based off Leviticus 25. And that whole pattern shows you that it's based off of the literal weekly cycle that God implemented at creation. So no, the 70 weeks are weeks, and Sabua, etc., is translated as weeks otherwise. And it's just as much a week as any other week of day, and weeks have days in them. And that's what it's based off of. So please stop saying it's 7 sevens any more than anything else is not a week, including the actual literal week. So just, accept your fate if you're going to deny a day for your principle. But the fact of the matter is, the Roman power, when it seized power, and this is going to be my next video, I'm going to show historically why the Catholic Church is the beast of Daniel 7, and with a consistent interpretation of understanding that the days in the prophecy rendered from a purely lunar calendar, that those are time periods of Christian history, because apocalyptic literature is focused on God's plan of salvation and the persecution of the saints during the time of its implementation after Jesus ascends to heaven and has brought the new covenant. Do you really think God's apocalyptic literature that tells the future all the way down to the end wouldn't include Christian history at all? How absurd. No. If your interpretation of Daniel has nothing to say about the Protestant Reformation, the persecution of the saints, that God left us completely without any understanding of Scripture and the future, when he lays out a pattern that everybody accepts of successive empires from Babylon up till the first coming, and then you say, oh, no, none of that's literal. It's all crammed in at the end, and it's when the Jewish temple comes back. No, God took away the temple and implemented the new covenant to save all of humanity. That is the pinnacle of the plan of salvation. Does your interpretation exclude that time period? If it does, I would suggest you consider rethinking and having a consistent interpretive method for the book of Daniel, particularly Daniel 7, 8, 9 through 12, and how that ties up to Revelation. God did not leave his church blind about what was coming. And because of that, that is why the Protestant Reformation occurred. And it's why America exists. And it's why you have a Bible on your shelf right now collecting dust.